Working on parts 5 and 6. We have the part 3 and 4 homework due tonight. We have the second half of the discussion due Wednesday, if you haven't done that already. And like I said, the exam is coming up on Wednesday. So let's start by reviewing what we were up to last time. And then we can talk about the new stuff in parts 5 and 6. So in parts 3 and 4, we were doing essentially two different things. The first of which was filling out this table here, which you can create just by copying and pasting the little subsection of sandwiches from a pivot table. And then the only thing I want to remind you is that you don't want to forget to fill in those 3 blanks with zeros so you don't run into issues later. Then in the second question of part 3, we were wanting to combine this table that was already here on our ingredients tab with this second table that we created potentially from a pivot table in order to figure out how many ingredients were used on any given day. Like for instance, if we know on July 1st, we ordered all of these sandwiches, we could then look up here to figure out how much bacon is required to fill all those sandwiches ordered on July 1st in order to figure out that it's 37 in that case. So in other words, we're taking this entire row up here, combining it with this entire column here, and getting one number. And while it is technically a sum product, you can't use the sum product function because the orientation of these two things are reversed. One's going left, right, one's going up and down. However, this is exactly what matrix multiplication does. And it's the sort of main reason that we learned about it in part 0. And so what we're doing is taking every single one of these rows up here, combining it with every single one of these columns here. And each one of those combinations creates one of these numbers down here. So that's how you can get the answer to part 3, question 2. Even though it's only asking about that row, you might as well do it for the entire month because it doesn't take any extra effort. So that's part 3 plus a little extra. Then in part 4, they want us to look at specifically the 7-day period from the 25th to the 31st. So this set of 7 days over on the right-hand side of our table to figure out how many BLTs are ordered across those 7 days. So we can see in our table how many BLTs were ordered in each of these individual days. All we have to do is add them up in order to get the 112 that are ordered across those 7 days. However, one thing I want to point out is just like with this table, where the workbook didn't ask us to do this for the entire month, but I mentioned it's a good idea. We can create a 7-day version of these next 2 tables for the entire month, even though the workbook is only asking about this set of 7 days here, from the 25th to the 31st. Like, what about from the 1st to the 7th? And what about from the 2nd to the 8th? Now, you don't technically need that for part 4, but it's going to be quite helpful in part 5. But either way, this column over here is the only thing they're asking about in part 4. And we can get all of those numbers just by looking up here in our single day tables and adding up the appropriate 7 days. So we can get like a 7-day total down here. So there's no crazy functions going on. We're just looking at the 2 tables above and pulling out the numbers we want. Okay, then there's one more follow-up question. I'm going to take this last column. I'm going to copy and paste it over to my inventory tab. So it's right there at the moment. And then I'm going to compare it to my inventory, which was already here. So I pasted it down here so they can be side by side. It's unnecessary, but that's where these numbers come from. And then we're trying to figure out how much of these ingredients we want to order. Well, if you need 329 and you already have 149, the amount you need to order is just the difference, the amount left over that you need to make up that gap for. And the only weird part is when you have things like this where you need 47 ounces of chicken, but you already have 60, well, then you don't need to order anything. So what I have over here is like an if statement that either puts a 0 there if I have enough already, or it tells me how much I need to order by comparing these two numbers. And that's the last question in part 4. What we're doing today in part 5 is looking at something called a rolling total. And this is something that was actually already on my spreadsheet. A rolling total is just, for example, this little dot here. How many meatballs were used across the 7-day period from the 1st and then ending on the 7th? And then this next number, how many meatballs were used from the 2nd to the 8th, and then 3rd to the 9th, and so on and so forth. So every one of these numbers represents a set of consecutive 7 days and how much ingredients we used across those 7 days. And then they just made a graph. And then there is a follow-up question about amount to order, which is near identical to the last question in part 4, except instead of picking out a specific set of 7 days, you're just using the highest 7-day total. So like for instance, for meatballs, it's probably one of these two numbers up here. So that is why this table is extremely helpful. So even though like what's going on is like part 4 is only asking about this set of 7 days, part 5 is asking about any set of consecutive 7 days. And then like the graph would just be like one of these two rows here, where we have the end date as our x-axis, and then one of these rows of white numbers as our y-coordinates. And then you can make a graph as necessary. Then in part 6, it's very similar to part 5, except instead of doing 7-day totals, you're going to be doing 7-day averages. That's the only difference, which means in your spreadsheet, you want to make another one of these tables, except instead of adding up these 7 numbers to figure out how much bacon was used from the 1st to the 7th, you're going to average those 7 numbers and then say like on average, we used 30 point some ounces of bacon or whatever that number is. So that's what's going on in part 6. And then it's just more graphic. So it's essentially just one more of these large tables.